Undesigned coincidences are a type of evidence. They help confirm someone's story is true, and Christians can use them to strengthen their case that the stories in the Bible are true. The problem is that undesigned coincidences can be difficult to understand, but once you understand them, you will see how powerful they can be. So, allow me to explain undesigned coincidences as simply and clearly as I can, and then you'll hear some examples from the Bible that you can use for yourself or explain to others. In order to understand undesigned coincidences, imagine that you have two friends who live together as roommates down the street, Jesse and Kyle. Jesse comes up to you and he says, "Guess what? Kyle and I saw an elephant yesterday." You think, okay, there's no zoo near us. Is Jesse being serious or is he pulling my leg? He goes on saying, "Yeah, Kyle and I were headed to the bank, turning the corner of 23rd Street, and we saw an elephant coming out of a trailer. Must have been a rich kid having a birthday or something." You're still suspicious? Like, why would two roommates be going to a bank anyway? That's not a typical roommate outing. Seems like a made-up story. But later, you meet up with Kyle, and he confirms he saw an elephant while driving with Jesse. You're still not sure if they're telling the truth, but you start talking about other things. And you ask Kyle, "So, how was your weekend?" He says, "Well, on Saturday I was at Home Depot buying a part to fix my washer, and my brother called. We hadn't talked for months, but he was telling me about this new opportunity, blah, blah, blah." Now, if you are really, really observant, you might notice a connection between these two stories of Jesse and Kyle. Jesse said that the two of them were driving to a bank. Kyle mentioned that he picked up a part for his washer. Both of these details were unimportant to their stories, but together they provide new information. Evidently, their washing machine is broken. This means anyone living at the house would need to go to a laundromat to wash their clothes. Many laundromats still require you to pay with quarters, but if you don't have a ton of quarters sitting around, where do you go first? The bank. Putting it all together, you find that Jesse and Kyle's stories fit together nicely. The washer broke, so they drove to the bank to pick up coins so they could wash their clothes. On the way, they saw an elephant. This connection between Jesse and Kyle is an undesigned coincidence. An undesigned coincidence occurs when two or more stories are told, and they include details connecting the stories together, but the details weren't intended to connect the stories together. Generally speaking, we are safe to assume that a detail wasn't intended to connect with another story if it's an unnecessary incidental detail or if the stories are unrelated. Undesigned coincidences are important because it's evidence, not proof, but evidence that both stories are told truthfully. Why is this the case? Well, when two stories fit together nicely, they are believable. But what if the two storytellers worked together in secret to make their stories fit? Then their stories are not believable. But in the case of undesigned coincidences, it's highly unlikely that the two storytellers worked together to make their stories fit. Again, the details weren't intended to explain each other. Do you really think Jesse and Kyle were in a room together saying, "Okay, Kyle, I'll say that we were driving to the bank. You say you were buying a piece for the washer over the weekend. Fits perfectly. When we tell people we saw an elephant, they're going to think we're telling the truth"? That's expecting way too much. In fact, the most likely scenario is that you would not be paying attention to these incidental details. At best, you would only wonder why Jesse and Kyle, two roommates, were going to the bank together. And besides the point, Kyle wasn't even talking about the elephant when he mentioned the washer part. He was talking about a phone call with his brother. So the details about the bank and the washer part were not part of an elaborate plan. Rather, they were undesigned. And yet these undesigned details just so happened to appear in conversation, and they fit together nicely, making them an undesigned coincidence. Such a coincidence does not normally happen unless both storytellers are speaking honestly. After all, when truth is told, everything fits together. When lies are told, they don't. Undesigned coincidences can also work with only one storyteller. For instance, it could have been that Kyle mentioned both the trip to the bank encountering an elephant and his broken washing machine in two separate stories. It's highly unlikely that Kyle invented an elaborate lie with those details by himself, because again, they are two totally different stories that fit nicely together because of unimportant incidental details. In both stories, it would be reasonable to conclude that Kyle was simply being truthful. The Bible also contains stories, and many Christian thinkers have started noticing that there are a lot of undesigned coincidences among stories in the Bible. For example, in Matthew chapter 4, Matthew writes that Jesus called Peter and Andrew, two fishermen, to follow him. Then he asked the same of James and John while they were mending their nets. Why were they mending their nets? Matthew doesn't say. It's just a random incidental detail. But in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, the same story is told, only in greater detail. Before Jesus told Peter and Andrew to follow him, he asked them to cast their nets into the water, and there was this miraculous catch of fish so big that their nets were breaking. So they called their partners in the other boat to help them. Verse 9 says these partners were James and John. So James and John were involved in this net-breaking catch of fish. This explains why Matthew said they were fixing their nets when Jesus called them to become followers. The stories fit. It's an undesigned coincidence. Genesis 24 introduces Isaac's wife, Rebekah. Verse 15 says that Rebekah is the granddaughter of Abraham's brother. Isaac, however, is Abraham's son. This is kind of an odd detail. You have Abraham's son marrying the granddaughter of Abraham's brother. You'd think that there must be a huge age difference between the newlyweds. This is never explained in Genesis 24. But going back to Genesis 18, we learn that Abraham's wife will give birth to Isaac in her old age. This means Isaac would have been younger than we would expect when he met Rebekah. In fact, he probably looked like Abraham's grandson. The stories now fit nicely, explaining an otherwise strange marriage arrangement. It's an undesigned coincidence. In 1 Thessalonians 2:2, Paul is writing to the church of Thessalonica, and he says, "But though we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict." Evidently, something shameful happened to Paul in Philippi that the Thessalonians know about. What happened? Paul doesn't tell us. But in the book of Acts, written by Luke, we learn that Paul and Luke were falsely accused in Philippi and thrown into prison without a proper trial, which should not have happened given Paul's Roman citizenship. They are released, and shortly after, they travel to Thessalonica. So it makes sense that the Thessalonians would have known about the shameful things done to Paul in Philippi. It was fresh. He would have told them. And again, we have two stories that aren't trying to explain themselves, but they wind up doing just that. It's an undesigned coincidence. There are dozens of more examples we could give. J.J. Blunt, in his book on the subject, provides 146 undesigned coincidences across the Bible. 42 of them come from the Gospels and the book of Acts, which are central to the truth of Christianity as a whole. He adds 22 more if you compare those stories with the history of Josephus, a non-Christian historian living around that same time period. Taken separately, these undesigned coincidences are probably not enough to convince anyone that we can trust the Bible. But taken together, we find the pieces of evidence piling up. I recognize there are other parts of the Bible, especially in the Gospels, that seem to contradict each other. I don't think there are true contradictions. I have a separate video talking about that, which I'll include in the comments. But even if there are contradictions, it doesn't undo the evidence of undesigned coincidences. Honest people can still make mistakes in their stories, but dishonest people will not leave a trail of undesigned coincidences. At the very least, I think it's safe to say that the authors of the Bible were speaking honestly, recounting what they believed to be true to the best of their ability. That does a lot of work in the larger conversation about why we can trust the Bible. So, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.